Welcome, everyone. I think I will kick things off in just a second here. I wanted to speak a few words about this. This is not just a department colloquium, it's the Distinguished Lecture in Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access in ISYE. And we've got a lot of beeping with people entering the room still here. And then I will say a few words and then I'll hand things off. So I want to welcome everyone to our first distinguished lecture in IDEA in ISYE. So IDEA is Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access. It's just like a pop quiz when I have to remember what it stands for. I want to start today, though, with some background on this new lecture series. The seed for this actually started with our strategic planning, which started in our last academic year. And as a department, we decided to make inclusion and diversity a strategic priority. And we saw a need to promote professional development in IDEA and support activities that create a sense of connectedness and disseminate the latest scholarships and best practices related to inclusion, equity, diversity, and access. The need to have different kinds of speakers to provide new experiences to a wider set of attendees emerged from this discussion. We wanted to widen the types of talks that we have and also provide a signature educational component for faculty, students, and staff in the department. Last summer, I talked to Stephanie Mason, an alumna of the department, who shared some of these same thoughts as I did. She graduated a while ago, and she and I discussed our mutual interest in supporting women in engineering, and we both noted the positive impact that diverse speakers can have when it comes to inspiring students, broadening participation in engineering, and providing new educational experiences for the department. And as a result, we decided to start this distinguished lecture in IDEA in ISYE. So I turned to the IDEA task force to recommend a speaker, and they came back and they recommended Professor Joi Mondisa from the University of Michigan as their top choice. And I'm so delighted that she accepted our invitation and is here with us today. So now to introduce today's speaker. Professor Joi Mondisa is an assistant professor in the Industrial and Operations Engineering Department and an engineering education faculty member at the University of Michigan. Prior to her graduate studies, she worked as a professional in the areas of manufacturing, operations, technical sales, and publishing for 10 years. She also served as an adjunct faculty member in engineering technology program at Triton College in River Grove, Illinois for 7 years. Dr. Mondisa is a recipient of the prestigious National Science Foundation's Early Career Award. In her research, she examines mentoring underrepresented populations in STEM, mentoring experiences and intervention programs in higher education, and learning experiences in engineering education. Let's give Dr. Mondisa a warm welcome.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for the information about the IDEA series. I'm so excited to be the inaugural speaker for this. And as you may or may not know, the University of Michigan is very much in support of advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we're actually doing very similar types of activities. So it's awesome to hear about that at Wisconsin as well. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Go. Okay. So, hello everyone. It's nice to see some of you again. I saw a few at the faculty discussion. As mentioned, my name is Joi Mondisa, and I'm really excited to be speaking with you today a little bit about my research, particularly because I love it and I love talking about it and sharing everything that I'm learning as well with others. And I do appreciate you accommodating me virtually. I really wanted to be there in person, but for your safety and health, as well as mine, we went with the virtual route. So I truly appreciate you joining me virtually today. And thank you for being here. My plan for today is to discuss some of my preliminary research about empirical mentoring approaches and strategies. I'll spend about 35 to 40 minutes discussing my work, and then we should have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. I will say I'm pretty good at keeping track of the chat. Let me make sure I see it here again. So if there's something that comes up, you want to drop it in the chat, let me know. Or if you just want to go ahead and unmute and ask a question, feel free to do so. And then we'll also have an opportunity to chat at the end. Okay, there's that chat button, great. Okay, so here's today's plan for the seminar. First, I'm going to start out telling you a little bit about myself, and then I'm going to spend some time discussing what is mentoring and what are the different types of ways in which mentoring occurs. I know there's a lot of literature and discussion about mentoring right now, and it's really been, I would say, a more heavily studied field recently, but there's a lot of information that we can learn from organizational and educational scholars who have done a lot of work already. So I'll talk about that a little bit. Then I'll touch upon some mentoring practices that have emerged from my most recent research. And I'll discuss some of the important takeaways and implications of this work that my team and I have been identifying, especially as related to mentoring equity. Just a note, today's seminar, I'm talking for about 35 or 40 minutes. I'm really only scratching the surface of what I call a very large mentoring iceberg. So there's a lot of information, but I wanted to pull out some of the most pertinent details that I'm finding in research and encourage you to definitely leverage and access other mentoring resources, which I will mention a little bit later. My main two goals are to, one, introduce you to some research-based mentoring practices and strategies, and two, to engage you to start thinking about the broader equity implications associated with mentoring. So we're moving towards that front, I think, in the research field. So I'll start off with telling you a little bit about what I've done and what I do. As mentioned, currently I'm an assistant professor of industrial and operations engineering, and I'm also an engineering education faculty member here at the University of Michigan. Our engineering education program was started in 2017. We've been thriving and growing, and what is unique about our engineering education program compared to other programs across the nation is that our program is the first, and so far only, that embeds traditional engineering education researchers in traditional engineering departments. What's unique about that is that our students will receive their PhDs from engineering education from the College of Rackham, but they are not a part of the home departments that we are part of. They're part of the program. A little bit about my history. I earned my bachelor's degree in general engineering from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I was delighted to see there's a lot of U of I alums here at Wisconsin. And then after graduating from my undergraduate program, I worked for 10 years in industry as a mechanical engineer, a senior engineer, and a technical editor in the areas of manufacturing, operations, technical sales, and publishing. So truly, I'm a non-traditional student. I truly, first and foremost, think of myself as an engineer, then as an engineering educator, and now growing into an engineering education researcher role. During this time, after I graduated, I also started teaching as an adjunct faculty member in the engineering technology program at Triton College. I loved working with practitioners, working and teaching at the same time, and engaging people in practicing the ideas we would talk about in class. And while also working at the community college and working full-time, I went ahead and pursued and earned an MBA from Governor State University in Illinois. Then, much to the chagrin of most of my family members, I decided to go ahead and pursue a PhD full-time. In particular, I explained my decision to pursue a PhD was really based on my experiences as an undergraduate at the University of Illinois. I had a lot of struggles in the beginning as an undergrad student, finding community and support. I was fortunate to actually become a part of the Merit Scholars Program there. And in doing so, I also was connected with a dean, connected through a dean at that time with a male mentor in that time, the general engineering department. And that was very impactful in my persistence and pursuit of my degree. And so I had a lot of questions about why those things were successful and why they were successful in helping me to continue on and pursue my degree. So with those questions, I decided to pursue the PhD full time. I attended Purdue University, where I earned my master's in industrial engineering and a PhD in engineering education. So I like to always joke that I am a Big Ten baby. I tend to love Big Ten schools. Now here at Michigan, I'm an embedded engineering education researcher in the IOE department. And in this role, I teach EER classes about the foundations of engineering education research and theoretical and conceptual frameworks in education. I also teach IOE classes about lean principles, really relying on my experience in industry as an engineer, as well as classes on continuous improvement in operations and engineering economic decision-making. So that's a little bit about me. And as an advisor, I advise both EER and IOE PhD students, shown here. I also work with student researchers and workers from other engineering and education departments. Our lab group members have a ton of different diverse research interests related to engineering, education, as well as industrial and operations engineering, particularly in the areas of learning, modeling, simulation, policy, and engineering experiences. So even though the research interests of my group vary across IOE and EER, there always tends to be some kind of common threads among our research topics, usually related to learning, mentoring, and diversity. Some of the projects that we're working on in our lab include investigating mentoring approaches, practices, and coping strategies. We look at hurricane evacuations and risk analyses, the mental health of engineering students, social community and mentoring relationships and programs, diversity in tech and STEM entrepreneurship programming, and cross-cultural and culturally relevant mentoring in STEM. In my research, I quantitatively and qualitatively examine mentoring relationships, programs, and approaches in STEM higher education. And my main research interest is really rooted in identifying what effective mentors do and say in their mentoring relationships. And today I'm going to share with you some of the themes about empirical mentoring practices that are emerging from my preliminary research. So let me tell you a little bit about that preliminary research related to mentoring by starting off with discussing what exactly is mentoring. I'm sure you've heard the term quite a bit, especially recently. So mentoring really has its roots in medical and teaching practices, and it originates from the Greek poet Homer's The Odyssey, in which Odysseus entrusts his friend Mentor with the role of educating and guiding his son when he goes off to fight the war in Troy. And mentoring has really been defined in various ways. So organizational mentoring scholars like Raggins, Cram, and Eby really define mentoring as a process in which a person, an experienced person, that being a mentor, provides career, emotional, and psychosocial support to a person with less experience, and that's the protege or mentee. Most recently, in 2019, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine produced the Science of Effective Mentorship in STEM report, and that was actually spearheaded by University of Wisconsin's Dr. Angela Byers-Winston and Dr. Christine Fund. And in this report, they define mentoring as a professional working alliance in which individuals work together over time to support the personal and professional growth, development, and success of relational partners through providing career and psychosocial support. And most recently, in my work with mentoring scholars, Doctors Becky Packard and Veranda Montgomery, we define mentoring as a developmental relationship that is really intended to support the growth of the learner forward, and it involves a constellation of mentors who have different assets and skills. So the point I want to make with these various definitions is that there are many definitions of mentoring, whether it's organizational mentoring, peer-to-peer mentoring, or mentoring within ecosystems. But the consistent theme across these definitions is that mentoring is a process that provides support. I also want to talk a little bit about what mentoring can look like. So mentoring can occur informally or formally through various types of mechanisms. So formal mentoring typically occurs in structured mentoring programs or relationships that are arranged by a third party. So some examples might be, let's say, mentoring programs that institutions may provide, whether it's for peer-to-peer or faculty-to-peer, or if there's faculty-to-faculty mentoring programs set up within the institution. Informal mentoring relationships tend to organically form from spontaneous interactions, and they tend to be based on shared interest or the potential of mutual benefit to parties involved. So for example, students may be informally mentored by faculty or peers in regards to their academic or career interests. I also wanted to note that mentoring relationships may occur in multiple forms. So they can be conducted in-person relationships, virtually, online interactions that may exist between dyads or multiple participants. There's some peer-to-peer mentoring that may occur through formal programs or informal interactions. And there's a ton of other configurations in which mentoring relationships may be structured as well. Now, what's important to note is that multiple recent reports have really highlighted a national imperative to broaden the participation of racially minoritized populations in STEM, such as persons who identify as Black, Hispanic, Latinx, or Indigenous. However, there must be some vetted and viable solutions that have been identified to support minoritized persons in completing their STEM degrees and going on and being successful in the workforce. And what I talk about is mentoring as one viable solution that has been shown in the literature to positively affect and influence the persistence of minoritized populations in STEM. Yet, for mentors in higher education, there's really minimal examples that exist that detail effective mentoring approaches and strategies that mentors use to help minoritized mentees to persist and succeed. So much of mentoring engagement with students, as we know, it may be experimental at best. Even seasoned faculty members who are mentors may not really fully comprehend their own mentoring competencies or how it's affecting mentees. And I argue that these factors are contributing to the stagnation of minoritized student success. And so in my NSF career project work, I propose that identifying and better understanding effective mentoring approaches and strategies that mentors use to support their students will allow us to really greatly impact who persists in STEM. So with that argument, I'd like to share with you some details from my pilot research study about mentors' practices and approaches. So thus far, my team and I, we've gone ahead and we have conducted a pilot study that informs my larger career research study. So in the study, we assess approaches used by mentors who help minoritized undergraduates persist in STEM fields. And in this work, we use 2 theoretical frameworks to examine mentoring approaches and strategies. And those theoretical frameworks are intersectionality and community cultural wealth. Before I tell you a little bit about those, I think I should maybe give you a little bit of background. I know we're all engineers, but from an educational research standpoint, one thing I talk about a lot with my colleagues, especially when I first came here and wanted them to understand the kind of research I did, was thinking about educational research from the perspective of being such that what would happen is you would ground your research in some form of existing educational theory or framework. And in doing so, you would use that to craft and cultivate your surveys, your protocols, and things like that, and use that in your analysis as well. And I find the difference between educational research and engineering research is we tend to flip it. So in the beginning with educational research, we start off with a frame, a theoretical framework or conceptual model based on research, and use that to guide our study. When I do, let's say, engineering research with simulations and modeling, we tend to run an experiment, find out what the results are, and then check to see if it fits into a certain framework or model. So I just wanted to stress that's kind of the flip side of how we do things from the educational research side before I tell you a little bit about these theoretical and conceptual frameworks. So, as I mentioned, I'm using intersectionality and community cultural wealth to examine how mentors help minoritized mentees persist in STEM fields. And so I want to talk a little bit about both of these. Typically, I think of intersectionality as being under the umbrella of being a critical race theory framework, and it's really been used to examine how the construction of social categories is tied to systemic oppression in American society. And as a lens, intersectionality has been used to examine how race and gender intersect and influence racial groups, resulting in experiences of cultural alienation or invisibility or spotlight anxiety, or even pressure to assume the role of representing your race or gender. And from an intersectionality perspective, having to deal with other people's perceptions due to any kind of identity aspect, and also the role of power in relationships, can really influence positively and negatively people's experiences. And in some cases, it can lead to experiences of discrimination or disenfranchisement. So for me, using this framework and the theory that existed about it was able to help me look at, what role do identity aspects and power play in mentoring relationships, and how mentors navigate their relationships with mentees, and vice versa with mentees with mentors as well. We also use the community cultural wealth model, and that was created by Tara Yoso. And this model really recognizes 6 forms of capital that are used by, I would say 6 forms of capital that are used as assets by communities of color. And so the capital in the model looks at aspirational capital, linguistic capital, familial capital, social, navigational, and resistant capital, and how these forms of capital help people navigate communities. And so the CCW framework has been used to examine the experiences of African Americans and Hispanic and Latinx people, but generally not so much to examine their mentoring experiences. So both of these frameworks were used as guides in constructing the study's interview protocol, as well as used in our analysis process. Let me tell you a little bit about the methods. For the pilot study phase, we interviewed and surveyed mentors about their mentoring competencies and approaches. For the pilot study, we recruited participants who needed to be a STEM professional who had been practicing for 5 years or more, and they have evidence of effectively mentoring racially minoritized undergraduate students in STEM. Now for my post-study, the study in which I've interviewed 68 mentors, these mentors were identified through a crowdsourcing process of the broader STEM community. For this data collection, let me first talk about the quantitative instrument, the MCA, and its origins. So if you don't know, your university has a wonderful center called CIMMER, and that stands for the Center for the Improvement of Mentored Experiences in Research. It is a nationally recognized center on campus. I hope you have all at some point accessed it. If not, I encourage you to do so. The center itself focuses on mentor and mentee training and resources. The center staff and participants have produced what's called the Entering Mentoring and Entering Research curricula, and it provides mentoring case studies and scenarios really centered around 5 main mentoring competencies. And those are maintaining effective communication, aligning expectations, assessing understanding, fostering independence, and promoting professional development. And what happened is the University of Wisconsin Institute for Clinical and Translational Research Group developed the Mentoring Competency Assessment, the MCA, that measures these entering mentoring competencies of mentors. So the MCA is a 26-item validated survey instrument that assesses mentors and mentees' perceptions of mentors' competencies. And it uses a scale of 1 to 7, rated from not at all skilled to extremely skilled. And it's primarily intended to be used as a self-reflection tool. For this study, we use the mentoring competency assessment to have the mentors assess their self-perceptions of their mentoring competencies in these 5 main areas. We also developed an interview protocol grounded in mentoring, intersectionality, and community cultural wealth literature. And then we do a step that I've learned from my dissertation research days, where we created what I call individual contextual backdrop summaries for each participant. And these are really detailed summaries about their backgrounds, context and experiences, some gathered from public websites, well, mostly gathered from public websites, and then kind of filled in from our interviews with them. And we use these contextual backdrop summaries in the interview coding process to really get the coder, the person who's going through and coding it, familiar with, who this person is, kind of what their background is before going through and coding the individual interview transcripts. Participants also completed the MCA survey prior to the interview, and they participated in the interview with us. And then we went ahead and conducted our data analysis, and we used thematic analysis to identify salient findings. So that's a high-level view of a highly complex data collection and data analysis process that's been used for this project. So for the pilot study sample population, the sample we used to pilot the survey and the interview consisted of 2 Black men, 1 Black woman, 1 white man, and 1 white woman. 3 of the participants are professors. Oh, let me note, these are pseudonyms, these are not their real names. 3 are professors, 1 participant is a staff member, and 1 is an administrator. And their ages range between 46 to 80 years of age, and collectively they have between 22 to 33 years of mentoring experience. So I want to take a look at some of the high-level descriptive statistics of the MCA survey results. And so on a scale of 1 to 7, looking at just the average lowest and highest ratings, we can learn a little bit about this group. So for maintaining effective communication, the lowest rated item in this case was coordinating effectively with mentees. And for this competency, it's possible that mentors may struggle with identifying ways to effectively coordinate with mentees given their schedules and restricted time. I'm sure we've all been there. However, they seem to feel more comfortable with their abilities to provide constructive feedback. Well, we're professors. What do we love to do more than to provide feedback to others and critique as well? So they felt a little bit more comfortable with that. In looking at aligning expectations, mentors feel highly skilled at helping their mentees to develop strategies, and they feel slightly less skilled in aligning their expectations with their mentees. And when it comes to fostering independence, the mentors felt very capable of acknowledging what mentees accomplish professionally, but they feel slightly less confident about being able to stimulate their mentees' creativity. Also, I would say for professional development, mentors tend to rate themselves as being highly skilled in being able to help mentees acquire resources, but they had the lowest average rating of all the competencies across the competency questions in regards to helping their mentees with work-life balance. And I kind of always joke that, well, that's kind of like, that's not too shocking considering we're probably not the best at work-life balance ourselves. One thing I wanted to note, or an interesting aspect about this, is that the competency scores in this group show that the mentors feel pretty skilled in their mentoring abilities. Like, I was surprised by the high numbers. After surveying the mentors, we went ahead and we then interviewed them about their mentoring approaches. But one thing I do want to note now that we're kind of beyond the pilot stages, this group of folks we selected based on just publicly available information. They seem pretty skilled. What I'm finding in the group of highly effective mentors who have been identified through crowdsourcing from the broader STEM community is they tend to rate themselves pretty modestly on the mentoring competencies, and they talk quite a bit about having room to grow and learn. So that's something I think that's a very important emergent theme from the current work that we're doing. So I also want to talk just a little bit about some of the things we found from the thematic analysis. We found that using the iterative thematic analysis process, there were certain themes that emerged. And I'm going to share with you just two of the mentoring approaches themes that have emerged from the pilot study itself. So first off, one theme that has emerged is that highly effective mentors tend to practice understanding mentees and their situations. So one mentor discussed focusing on needing to know the context of their mentee situation before being able to advise them. So they said, when an undergraduate applies at grad school, the first thing they do is they'll say to me, so where should I apply? And that's a very reasonable question, but I can't really answer it until I know more about what they're trying to accomplish, and also in the context of what their record is, so what is attainable. And we can have that conversation. We can talk through all the dimensions of it. I always say what I love about research is generally, to me, the findings aren't necessarily so surprising as just in some ways very surreal. So the fact that mentors work at trying to understand the context of mentees' situations, their goals, and who their mentees are before giving tailored advice tends to make sense. But I think what is coming out of the research that we're finding is the ways and methods and how they communicate this are very valuable. And I'm looking forward to really sharing that in future papers. So this idea that highly effective mentors really have specific ways and approaches and language for first learning how to understand mentees' context before even considering giving them any advice. And I mentioned earlier in a conversation, another thing that's come out of the recent data is they also, I would say a large percentage of them rarely give advice. They generally ask questions, leading questions, and they help mentees think through whatever question or problem they're confronting, where it's really the mentee themselves arriving at something and then maybe asking or them giving advice. Another emergent theme is that mentors ask mentees specifically about their goals, and they really help them to create awareness about what they need to do to achieve those goals. So one mentor talks about, pointing out what they have the power to do or what they're doing. And they say, I first try to get them to identify it. If that doesn't work, I'll always say, well, here's your goals. These are your goals. If you're not achieving them or making progress, this whole thing is about you. My whole thing is that self-awareness, that their choices are creating a situation where they're not able to advance towards something they want to do. My whole thing is, this is what you said you wanted to do, and I'm just like, walk me through it and tell me how you felt. It's all about this self-awareness and this realization that this path that they said they wanted to walk. So there's this theme where mentors require their mentees to help them identify what they need, and they scaffold them with support. So these are some of the preliminary approaches that emerge from the pilot study thus far. And what we're finding is that some of the preliminary findings are suggesting that mentors seek to understand mentees' context, and in doing so, they help mentees to be self-aware of their choices and options. Also, mentors ask their mentees questions to assist them in understanding their situation, and then they scaffold their answers for their mentees and help them learn through supporting them. And these insights really hint at ways that mentors support mentees' development as self-authors of their own experiences. I will say the majority of mentors speak specifically about not creating clones of themselves and their mentees, but really helping mentees to self-discover who they are and what they want to do. So the purpose of this preliminary study was to pilot the interview protocol and the logistics of the study, work out most of the kinks and see how things work. And my team will be presenting some additional preliminary findings for the pilot study in the upcoming American Society for Engineering Education paper this June. And so I want to show you some of those preliminary things that have come out as well. What the team found is that mentors of minoritized students found themselves needing to engage in active listening to adapt to their mentees' needs. There's a lot of talk about adapting and tailoring their approach to each specific mentee. And they tailor their advice and customize their approaches to serve the mentees' needs, even though they admit and talk about how this is not always a straightforward approach. Mentors also talked about realizing the need to provide honest feedback to best support their mentees. This looked like sometimes telling students hard truths about how the mentors viewed the situation or problem the mentee was facing. Generally, it was a point in the mentoring relationship where the mentor would ask the mentee for permission to share, or ask them, do you want my advice? It could also be a source of tension or difficult to manage. And that's an important aspect of the mentoring approach, especially that the decision-making was ultimately left up to the mentee. So mentors provide advice to support their mentees, but mentees have to choose to do what they want to do with that advice, and mentors make that clear. Also, mentors discuss the role of using conversation to facilitate goal setting to support their mentees' agency. So to do so, mentors use goal setting as a scaffolding technique to help their mentees' decision-making process. Generally, they approach goal setting as teaching their mentees to apply critical thinking to structure their decision-making process in these moments. And usually it read like a litter of questions, thought process questions. Not quite the engineering design process or the 5 whys, but definitely building upon, okay, so if you do this, if you drop out of the program, what will you do next? Okay, and what will that look like? And just building upon that and playing out the scenarios with them. I call that, I think there's another author who calls that the what if game. What if this, what if that? Another aspect we found is that mentors really shared how they enacted advocacy to protect their mentees. In another talk, I talk about the different roles that people can play as an advisor, a mentor, a sponsor, an advocate. And these mentees really talk about how they leverage their power and position and privilege in a lot of situations to advocate for their mentees openly and behind closed doors. And they talk about ways that they do that and enact that throughout their process of mentoring people. So that's kind of a broad overview of the study, the pilot study, and where we're at. Most recently, my team and I have just completed the survey and interview data collection of mentor and mentees perceptions and understanding for the larger study. And we're in the process of starting to analyze and hopefully publish that data pretty soon. From this larger study, I've started speculating on some opportunities for mentoring research and practice. So in particular, I've interviewed 68 highly effective mentors. I have learned so much. It's been such a privilege to learn from them and to have them share their stories and experiences. And what I've seen so far is that there are themes that are arising across the majority of their mentoring strategies. So specifically, mostly all of the mentors discuss the importance of active listening. So they really talk about how they actively listen, from how they engage their bodies to listen, how they listen through Zoom, how they listen in person, on Slack and WhatsApp channels. They have methods. They also talk about how they empower mentees. What does that look like? It can look like not just celebrating them and saying congratulations, but inviting them to bring their whole selves or to share about aspects of their identities in their lab groups, asking about, hey, let's, they ask a lot of questions. Oh, what is that? Oh, what's your favorite food? Oh, let's have that in the lab, or being very inclusive, but also being sure to empower mentees that they feel welcome to share certain aspects of themselves within a group. They also empower them to make their own decisions by asking guiding questions. So, as I also mentioned, most mentors tailor their approach to their specific mentees and their needs. That's why this active listening is important. That's why understanding the context is important, because that's how they're figuring out, okay, how can I best support and help this mentee? So they really focus on what I talk about in how to mentor, is they focus on empowering through information, teaching self-advocacy skills, and nurturing their professional development. So that's what the research shows. And in practice, this can look like empowering through information means discussing and explaining existing resources and how to access and use them, as well as administering personal information. So mentors don't make assumptions about people, they ask them and they make sure they know what exists and how to use them. And that ranges from what do they know about a particular environment or situation to, oh, are you attending office hours? Do you know what office hours are? Okay, this is what you should do when you attend office hours, talking to them from that aspect. In terms of teaching self-advocacy skills, they teach mentees to seek help and resources that they need and how to advocate for themselves to acquire what they need. They speak about specific ways and language they use to encourage students to engage in resources and access them and be strategic. They also talk about nurturing their mentees' professional identity development by identifying, suggesting, and encouraging mentees' participation in different professional development activities. That's why the active listening and the contextual understanding is so important, because they will also leverage their power and privilege if there's opportunities they know about to tell their mentees and support them in going after it. So these are some of the things I've been thinking about in terms of what the research is saying, what the mentors are saying, what it looks like in their practice, and how it might look in actual practice. As I mentioned, the larger portion of this project will focus on creating, hopefully, an arsenal of mentoring best practice options to help assist with promoting mentoring equity. my intent isn't only to identify empirical practices, but I really want to make visible the need for equitable mentoring engagement. So in particular with this work, I hope to make these practices visible of highly effective mentors to support mentoring efforts, but also to draw attention to the need for mentoring participation from everyone. I think there tends to be a need to automatically assume that you need to be this very nurturing, good-natured person. I'm not saying that doesn't hurt, but the truth is everyone has something to offer through mentoring. And mentoring is really a learning partnership where the mentor and mentee engage and learn from each other. And it really supports the use of capital to help support mentees. And really all faculty should be mentoring students, and all students should have equitable access to mentors. And that by engaging everyone in mentoring, that broadens the mentoring pool for students as well as others. So one way to really support equitable mentoring engagement is to promote accountability in practicing mentoring. For example, I think that faculty and staff should be required to report out their mentoring activities in their annual activity reports and teaching statements. Imagine if when you're writing up your teaching statement, it was a teaching and mentoring statement, and you spoke to what you taught and did in the classroom, as well as to how you're mentoring your TAs, your lab group, your advisees. So showing evidence that you are engaging and being accountable in something that is part of your role as an advisor / mentor. And this type of accountability, I believe, can really help support the development of equitable mentoring and make sure that mentoring is provided for all students from all backgrounds. In addition to seeking to improve mentoring at individual levels, mentoring really needs to be examined and improved through the infrastructure of various higher education ecosystems. So in a recently published work with Doctors Becky Packard and Verona Montgomery, we propose a STEM mentoring ecosystems framework to really better situate and understand and push on mentoring systems that are needed to bring about change in STEM fields. And we look at a STEM ME perspective, or using that perspective to really understand, what is affording some sources of mentoring? Why are there certain capacities of mentoring that are consistently cultivated or absent? What are the patterns of interactions that are more or less productive? And we've been using this framework as a lens to make sense of prior and future work on mentoring, including mentoring processes, structures, and contexts for capacity building. And so we can really use this to look at mentoring in a formal and informal mechanism. And in particular, as a research team, we've been encouraging institutions to assess their mentoring ecosystems to identify gaps and opportunities, and to help eliminate mentoring silos, as well as to leverage existing assets and stewards. So we feel that really understanding mentoring from this lens can really help to inform ways to improve mentoring ecosystems within organizations. And from my perspective, understanding both mentoring practices and mentoring ecosystems will be pivotal to ways for us to better support our students, staff, and faculty. So with that, I would like to conclude my talk. And I'd like to thank my graduate students, Nagash, Clarke, and Sarah Jane Bork, for their work and contribution to the project. And I'd also like to acknowledge the National Science Foundation for funding support for this work. And I'll be very excited to share more details of the project as it continues to evolve and develop. So I am open to any questions and conversation. Thank you.
I guess I'll kick things off with a question. I was wondering if your research touched on self-efficacy, and sometimes I know it's very interrelated with independence, and you talked about independence, and I'll just ask you an open-ended question there.
So I would say, in terms of self-efficacy, I actually have not looked at that aspect related to mentoring practices. I have looked at that aspect related to engineering students' experiences. I haven't found anything, well, I have to be honest, I wasn't looking for its relationship to mentoring when I was talking to the students. I was looking more for their involvement in the program. But I would venture to think that from the research I've conducted so far, the relationship to self-efficacy is probably positively correlated to how people feel supported and mentored by their peers, faculty, and staff. I think what we're trying to figure out now is most of the work says mentoring is positive. There are negative experiences. We can speak to what causes negative experiences, but now we're really trying to focus on how we know what causes positive experiences. How do we leverage that to increase the self-efficacy of students? And I think that's where we're headed in terms of the scholarship and the direction. I call it, and I'm an IE, but I think I'm very interested in operationalizing mentoring. So yes, we know it works. What does that look like in practice?
John, and then Angela.
Great. I really enjoyed your presentation and conversations this morning, so thank you very much for that. One question that came to mind, and there may be no answer for this, but I'm curious your perspective. One of the things Laura mentioned was the surveys of graduating PhD students generally felt satisfied with their mentoring experience. And it occurred to me there could be a selection bias. Those who didn't get good mentorship left. And I wonder if you have any sense for how large a contribution poor mentoring is to people who fail to complete the PhD process.
That's a good question. So I would say not from my work, or from some work that my student is currently doing on mental health and engineering graduate students. What we found in the literature is that there tends to be several different layers of aspects that contribute to why students leave a PhD program, at least in the group of students she's talking to. Now, mind you, these students haven't left, but typically it's a combination of, did you feel support from your advisor? I think I just read something recently that spoke to, or it was a survey taken where students felt supported by their advisor, but they still felt a lack of community in their program. It may have been a climate survey or something like that. So there's a lot of different factors that tend to influence why students have a productive experience, why they leave, why they stay. I do think that one of the major factors, though, is you need to at least have a good point. What would I call it? A pivotal point needs to be good advising, but students still need community. I've studied social community, and that could be from their peers. They still need access to resources. So I think it's a culmination of different things where even if they have a great advisor, if there's other aspects that aren't being tended to or supported, that can also influence. It's hard to pinpoint to say it's just one thing.
It's sort of like an ecology.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Good afternoon, Professor Mondisa. So good to see you. I want to add my appreciation to others for your wonderful scholarship and for advancing the mentorship literature. I apologize, I'm off campus. I'm not in a stable place. So I'll spare you my background right now. I want to hear your insights regarding the conceptual lens of intersectionality and how that is showing up in your research. It sounded like the larger project is going to take that on, but are there any hints or breadcrumb trail ideas you can give us about what are some of these effective mentors doing relative to navigating intersectional identities of their own and between themselves and their mentees? So if there's anything you can give us a little glimpse on, I'd love to hear that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you for joining. I should also mention that the wonderful Dr. Bias Winston is an advisory board member for my lovely career work, and she has been phenomenal. But in terms of the intersectional aspects, one thing I noticed in using intersectionality, I noticed that typically what comes out in the work, I call it, it tends to be subsumed. So what happens is mentors start to talk about something, like I don't have to ask right out about, oh, what are these aspects of your identity or culture? Usually they talk about an experience, and that provides insights into their intersectional identities, as well as how that plays a role in their relationship with their mentees. And most prominently, and I think I mentioned this earlier to a group of people, what I've noticed in terms of the role intersectional identities play with highly effective mentors is that mentors of all racial and ethnic and gendered backgrounds who are, I can't say comfortable, who maybe feel the discomfort and do it anyway and engaging with their mentees, especially their minoritized mentees, around any aspects related to identity, they are good with it, because what I'm finding is they tend to have some lived experience, which they have been able to either assume the perspective of being othered, or they've been othered, or they've been able to assume that perspective. So they are very comfortable in talking about how identity plays a role, or aspects of people's identities in their experiences, and communicating about that with their mentees. They also are very sensitive and aware and acknowledge to their mentees, they communicate to them, I may not have this aspect of my identity, I can't relate to it, but they stand in solidarity. They talk about letting them know, I believe you and how you feel, or what occurred, or what you say is some aspect of influence of some aspect of your identity influencing your experience. And they talk, they let the mentees talk them through it. So I guess thinking about intersectional identities and how it's showing up in these mentoring relationships, the most important thing I've noticed is these mentors are open and comfortable with allowing mentees to talk about these aspects of themselves. And more importantly, they're interested, they're open to learning, and it keeps showing up in these conversations they have with their mentees, not so much as just racialized or gendered or some other cultural aspect, but just knowing the person. And they seem comfortable with being uncomfortable doing it, because they've had some lived experience that they can somehow relate to it, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you so much.
Oh, the summary of the findings for today, and thank you for that question, Dr. Byers-Winston. It can be found in our ASEE paper. We will be publishing it, and we'll be in Minnesota presenting it. It'll be published next month, I believe. I'm very excited. I also should note, I know we're almost in time, I'm really excited because I'm sharing with you the pilot study. The richness of what is found in the larger study is outstanding. I'm actually able to start putting together words, language that these people use and speak to in their mentoring relationships. And that has been like an overarching goal. I love SIMMER. I love the case studies and scenarios. And it's been a dream of mine to be able to leverage that, but also add to it where you could read a case study and say, here's some things you might consider thinking about, reflecting on, and saying in the situation to help aid us as professors and faculty mentors.
Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I think we should let people go because I know other people have meetings. And I just want to thank you again, Dr. Mondisa, for a fantastic and insightful talk, and also for sharing some of your latest and greatest research that is yet to be published. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure for me.